Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's forum on the question of mandating vaccines. My name is Michael DeWilde. I'm the director of the Koeze Business Ethics Initiative here at the Stephen College of Business at Grand Valley. And I'm very pleased to be joined by our two guests. To my immediate left, Dr. Alejandro Quiroga, who is Senior Vice President, Population Health at Spectrum Health here in Grand Rapids. And farther to my left, Erik Daly, who is a corporate and labor law attorney for Miller Johnson here in town. They've agreed to speak to some of the questions around mandating vaccines from both a legal and medical point of view. We'll also talk about it in terms of the ethics. I wanted to do this particular forum in concert with the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation and the Family-Owned Business Institute as co-sponsors, because we've gotten a number of questions, concerns, some more impassioned than others, about this question of mandating vaccines. To whom will it apply? Should we go ahead and do it? What are healthcare organizations doing on this question? What are all the ramifications of it? People are expressing some confusion, as you know, some hostility. Others are demanding it in order to safeguard public health. So we'll try to unpack this by shedding more light, hopefully, than heat on the issue. I've asked our two guests from their respective professional points of view to kind of just set the stage by taking a 30,000-foot view. What is at issue in terms of vaccine mandates? I'll start with Dr. Quiroga. The question of what is the medicine, what's the science tell us at the moment about the vaccines, their application, and any concerns people might have?
Well, thank you, Michael. I confirm that everybody can hear me well. Thank you for having me. This is a very interesting conversation and an important forum. I'm always up for what it's become a very difficult conversation, but I feel that I can look at people in the eye and stand behind a lot of the science of this issue. And we're in an interesting time of life because it is very tempting for us to think that social media has made these conversations harder. And I will appeal to everyone that these conversations have always been hard. I think about Semmelweis, who before we even know that viruses and microbes exist, discovered that washing your hands somehow decrease bad outcomes after delivery, puerperal fevers that females were having. You just had this horrible septic shock from physicians enabling labor with dirty hands. And he just knew that proved scientifically that worked, and everybody thought he was a charlatan. Because we didn't know about microbes, we didn't understand how it worked, but the scientific method held true at that moment. I mean, and now no one questions the fact that there's things that we cannot see that are in our hands that could make you very ill, like coronavirus. And I think it's fascinating for the scientific perspective that when this pandemic started in 2019, I remember vividly us thinking that the best case scenario will be that we will have a vaccine like the flu, that it will be probably 65% effective, and we will be blessed to have that in a reasonable time period. And here we have more than one vaccine that is 95% effective, that it absolutely works without a doubt, that it has very few and mild side effects, and we're questioning the science of it. And to me, is just one of the major and probably one of the most prominent scientific discoveries of the past 100 years.
For everybody who's tuning in, and we do, I'll say to the people who are zooming in, we've got a few people here in studio as well. We limited the numbers for reasons of COVID. Do you, in layman's terms, can you say a little bit about the science itself? As you know, there is a fair bit of mistrust out there. Why should we trust it? What you're saying is the empirical evidence suggests that it's eminently trustworthy, that people are taking the vaccine, they're not getting sick. It's 95% effective. Can you say a word about how it works?
You want me to go into like the actual science of how it works? I'm trying to like make it like, but I mean,
a little bit anyway.
Yeah. So not to,
I'll tell you when I lose it.
yeah, please do, because this is where, like, if we can put in a sign in the screen that nerd alert or something like that.
I can apply to all of us, I think, so just have it rolling at the bottom. of the
Please
screen.
do, yes. So there are different vaccines, but the ones that are like more known are the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine, that they work in a similar way. And the way they work is you are injecting an mRNA and in a vehicle that is going to be inserted in your cells. And what mRNA is we know that DNA gets translated into mRNA. DNA is where we code for all the information that we need to build our cells. It gets translated into mRNA. mRNA gets translated into proteins, and proteins get expressed. We are made out of, basically, for the most part, proteins, right? That's how we get muscles, that's how we get tissue, etc. So what we're using is the machinery of the cell to insert that mRNA so it can make a protein that is expressed in the surface of the coronavirus and the COVID-19 with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And then that protein gets expelled outside of the cell, and our immune system recognizes that protein, that surface protein of the coronavirus, and develops immunity against it.
Thank you.
Did I lose you?
Not at all.
Okay, good.
But that probably was the limit. So.
Okay, good.
Thanks. Eric, I have a couple follow-up questions. I'm going to play devil's advocate from time to time. But Eric, let me ask you the same thing. From a legal perspective, where are we in terms of the mandates?
Sure. And I'll just say the same as Alejandro. Thank you so much for arranging this discussion, Michael. And Alejandro, thank you for bringing your expertise on the scientific side, which is beyond me. I'll try my best to follow it. But on the legal side, I think there are quite a few parallels to what Alejandro mentioned on the scientific side, right? There are some longstanding concepts, at least under US law, that probably still apply, right? So if we think about washing our hands, right, that's kind of a basic thing and we take for granted now. There's some longstanding constitutional law that supports the idea, at least, of state and local governments having the ability to impose and require mandates. Whether that extends to the federal government is less charted territory, and I think is something we'll see play out in the coming months. But there doesn't really seem to be any serious disagreement that if I'm a private business owner, or if I'm a university or a state and local government, as long as I comply with things like the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Civil Rights Act to accommodate religious exemptions and exemptions based on genuine disabilities, that I'm on solid ground to impose and to require vaccination as a requirement for participating in the activity of attending a classroom session, of working in a business. That person, in theory, can always leave their job. They can decide to exit the university or wait until the pandemic has passed. And so in that sense, state, local, and private vaccine mandates or requirements with exemptions, depending on how you want to position it, are on solid legal ground. And I think where we'll see some more interesting, at least from my perspective as a lawyer, the nerd alert coming up, will be with the new requirements at the federal level, where the Department of Labor has been tasked with writing a rule that will apply, in theory, to all employers with 100 or more employees, in addition to some other groups like federal government workers and contractors, and as hospital systems that receive Medicare reimbursements and things like that. But in particular, the 100 employer requirement, I think, may bump up against different judicial philosophies and views of the Constitution that will make for some interesting sideline watching and reporting in different courts around the country, and ultimately probably in front of the Supreme Court.
So you expect this to be litigated for the foreseeable future?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Okay.
As soon as the rule is released and there's a ripe claim, Right now, and sorry to interrupt, President Biden has directed and requested and mandate, authorized mandate, told the Department of Labor to write this rule, and we're expecting at any time now. They need to be very careful in the way that they write it to address the types of concerns that I suspect we'll be discussing for it to withstand constitutional review, especially with the current makeup of the Supreme Court.
Okay. And I expect most of those issues will come down between public health interests expressed by the state versus individual autonomy.
Yes, in some cases, when we think about individual autonomy, if we want to be more specific about that in the constitutional sense, it will focus on probably First Amendment and in particular religious freedoms, maybe expanding beyond that as a required exemption. It's not clear right now that there is a requirement to have a religious exemption. And in fact, in general, as long as laws are applied neutrally without directly targeting a particular religion, there's not generally always required to be a religious exemption for these things. The public health angle is interesting because historically the federal government has not had I keep using the word mandate, which is loaded in this context, has not had the general police power and health and safety as a specific enumerated constitutional power. There is a reference to general welfare in the Constitution, but for the federal government to act, you need to have a specific authority in the Constitution. Otherwise, powers are reserved to the states. And it's almost always been the case up until now that states and local governments have been those that have implemented vaccine requirements. Schools do it, of course, universities do it. Some healthcare systems do it for the flu vaccine and the like. And all those things have been upheld under a line of cases that started with a 1904 case called Jacobson versus Massachusetts. Some things are very different now, and we can talk about it in relation to the science, as well as just the political dynamic and how things differ. But yes, at the end of the day, it'll be, does the federal government have a sufficient hook, whether it's public health, whether it's expressed through a statute that gives the president and the executive the power, such as the Occupational Safety and Health, OSHA, that's the vehicle they're putting out the 100 employee requirement through, whether that's a sufficient hook for the federal government to act on this broad a basis will definitely be litigated. And yes, the personal autonomy, religious expression will sort of be the other side of that argument.
I have a question for both of you, but before I ask it, does the 100-person requirement seem at all arbitrary to you? Do you know if that's an instrumental consideration? In other words, if you've got 100 people or more, well, you could afford to lose 1, 2, 3% based on their objections. But if you're under 100, why that distinction?
So I'll speculate on the legal side. Interested to know if Alejandro has any insight on the medical side. Again, with the rule not having been released yet, or at least the last time I checked, it wasn't released yet. I suspect the reason for the 100 employee threshold, at least on the legal side, is that provides an argument that these types of large employers are engaged in what we'd call interstate commerce, sufficient that regulation of those types of large businesses is constitutionally authorized by the Commerce Clause in the Constitution, providing that federal hook for President Biden to say, I am acting under Department of Labor and OSHA authority to issue this emergency rule. And it's justified because almost by definition, these large employers are engaged in interstate commerce.
Thank you. So the question goes to the principle of do no harm, I suppose. Some of the objections to a mandate might run along the lines of, look, putting something in somebody's body via a needle or incision of any kind is probably one of the most invasive things you can do to another human being, especially when another human being really has to simply trust that, you know, everything you're saying is true and will be handled in a safe and you know, reliable manner. So one of the objections would be, well, look, is there any other way to come at least close to safeguarding the health and well-being of individuals, but not going so far as to mandate vaccines? Couldn't we do it through mask wearing, proper social distancing, proper hygiene, any number of other ways? This seems like the most extreme, given that I do have a right or an interest in my own personal autonomy and not having that violated. Aren't there any other ways to approach this?
I mean, that's a really good question, and it has many different answers. I mean, there are many different ways to tackle this, and not one way is 100% like effective. And I think you need to apply a multitude of layers on it. Yes, it is invasive to give a vaccine, yet it's gonna save millions of lives. I am not here to make an argument for mandates. I am here to make an argument for defending our position as a healthcare system to make this a requirement, as we have a duty to our community to provide the safest care possible. And in my mind, that would be best accomplished by getting vaccinated and implementing other safe measures. I don't think like you will like any of our providers walking into your room not washing their hands, or you know, in the appropriate cases wearing the appropriate protective gear. So it is a hard thing. I think I respect people's individualities, but we also have to think about the greater good. And from delivering healthcare is just, I think, a very important part. By delivering healthcare, we're applying the scientific method, and I sure hope that most of us believe in the scientific method. And I mean, I think there's no doubt that it works.
Is there anything to the argument that, look, I have natural immunity? I had COVID, I recovered from it, it wasn't that bad. I'm speaking in the universal eye, not me personally. Isn't there some evidence suggesting that my natural immunity would act, if not quite as effectively as a vaccine, close enough that, again, you wouldn't have to go to the extreme of violating my own, you know, personal autonomy not to have it?
I agree, and we have an exception. If we can demonstrate natural immunity within certain window, we will accept you from the vaccine requirement at our institution. And that's interesting because when we were like coming up with this ruling, there was not a strong scientific evidence that natural immunity with COVID would hold ground. It is tempting to think so, but we know of many infections that natural immunity just give you long-lasting immunity. And in certain windows, COVID does. And that's just a paper that came a few months ago. Like, it's quite recent, but very strong literature showing that it does hold. And we change our mind based on that, which we use that as evidence comes and becomes, we have better evidence of things working. We will adjust to the evidence and try to hold ourselves to that high standard.
That's a great point, Alejandro. And I think one of the read somewhere, like, the only predictable thing about this whole virus and pandemic has been that it's unpredictable. Right? One day you think you know all there is in the literature, and then the next day there's some new study that sheds a different light on it. And you have to factor that in if you're in the decision-making position. Taking it from the legal side, again, kind of going back to the upcoming federal rulemaking for the employers with more than 100 employees, because that would impact about 80 million people. And many of those people are probably already vaccinated. I think if we apply the numbers, say maybe 45 to 50 million of those people are likely vaccinated, but we're still talking about 30 million plus people. So is there an alternative means? How do we make sure that, one, just ethically, we've considered that issue as stewards of the public welfare and a society that does value personal autonomy and liberty. And any time that's being restrained, kind of examines it carefully. How do we weigh that against the constantly changing best guidelines and practices? And I think that's where a lot of our clients and business owners, you know, get, I don't want to say frustrated, but it's, you know, people get COVID fatigue because it's changing so frequently, and that's part of it. But as to the rulemaking itself, what the OSHA rule or the underlying legislation says is that there must be a grave danger. And I think there's general consensus that COVID would present a grave danger, but there's also a requirement that for this emergency rule, which can only stay in place for 6 months, that the rule, the response to the rule is going to be proportionate and necessary. And I think this begs that question, is whether the vaccine is necessary. Now the rule will have a sort of an exemption for weekly testing. So if you want to look at it more as an alternative choice between a vaccine or a test, you know, maybe that's a more proportionate response, right? And so it'll be interesting to see what's in that final rule in terms of the exemptions, the alternatives, the opt-outs, whether there are more beyond the ADA and sincerely held religious belief. They're going to have to consider all those things, including natural immunity, I think, in order to withstand, you know, judicial review that may not be as accommodating to an expansive federal power, especially when it comes to just general matters of health and not a specifically enumerated constitutional power.
Erik, I was reading, there was an MLive article not so long ago, did a poll of West Michigan employers, small, medium. You know, the number one reason that we're thinking not to mandate, even though we have the legal right to, is that we're already in a labor shortage. I really can't find myself down another 1 to 5%. I'm wondering if that's what you're hearing, and when you consult with people. And then to Alejandro, you obviously are confronting this very directly in terms of spectrum frontline workers who, you know, even as I read it, not so much physicians, but other medical people, some have their own doubts about this. So maybe you can both speak to what you're hearing direct and seeing directly in terms of the people that you work with.
Yeah, I can briefly go. I'd be interested to hear Alejandro's response, but I'd say that one of the first so the questions have changed throughout the course of the pandemic. And as an aside, I think it's amazing that we're having serious discussions about the ethics of 10 months ago, how to parcel out a limited amount of vaccine, right? And then here we are, you know, at the end of the year, having the opposite discussion of the ethics of how do we get more people to take it, if that's the right approach. But that's been sort of the theme, is what are other people doing? What are other employers doing? Everybody wants to know that. And then, yes, there's a kind of a collective action problem, I guess, right? Because if one employer says, you know what, it's however they feel, whether it's their ethical duty, whether it's in the best business judgment because they don't want to be dealing with as many sick days or potential for lawsuits from, you know, people who are affected in the workplace, they may say, yeah, I think it's the right thing to do to implement a vaccine requirement with some appropriate exemptions or required exemptions, or something close to that, provide incentives for vaccination, make it a workplace priority, something that's very visible from leadership. But they are very definitely concerned in the tight labor market about being the first mover on that front, especially smaller businesses. And this may go back to your question, Michael, about the 100 employee rule, whether a business of that size can sustain the loss of a few people who might not be willing to get a mandate, whereas a smaller business wouldn't. I think smaller businesses in particular, just the administration of it is challenging because what do you do with all the personal health information, right, that you're collecting from people if you have a vaccine requirement or a testing opt-out? Either way, you're collecting, pretty sensitive information about your employees. So I think mainly they want somebody who has been through it with other employers, kind of seen different practices play out in the marketplace and how they've impacted employee retention or lack of retention, so that they can kind of create the best balance for their particular circumstance. But absolutely, there's a fear that they will be short-staffed if they take too many steps in the direction of a vaccine mandate or something like that.
Yeah, it's a major concern of us. And I mean, we came up with a requirement before the government did, but we were pleased to hear that the government did for healthcare systems, because it was creating a little bit of a time bomb when we already short-staffed because of the pressures that the pandemic has created on its own. We have people that have been working the hardest for this community over the past 18 months, and the degree of burnout is palpable. There's people who are quitting healthcare altogether. And there is also, you can sign up for certain traveling jobs that are paying enormous amount of money. You can be a nurse right now and go to California and easily make your year's worth of salary in a shorter period of time. So we definitely have been concerned about this. And it's a very difficult balance between upholding what we think is the right thing for us to inspire the trust in our care, and at the same time hear our employees and make sure that we're creating the enough balance in the requirement that you have a certain natural immunity is a good example, you'd be exempt, but like we're certainly very concerned from that perspective, and we're still working closely to see where this is going to land.
Well, may I ask, Alejandro, I'm just curious because I'm vaccinated, and that was not under a mandate or a requirement. I came into kind of preparing for the panel with that frame of mind, like kind of pro-vaccine, and I still am, pro-vaccine. But I think I have a more nuanced mindset as it relates to the mandate and the potential near and long-term impacts of that as it relates to, for an employer, especially a healthcare system, trust with their staff, right? And should something like this happen again, or another type of emergency, like ethically, do we think about it as just this discrete instance of a pandemic? How do we think about it over the long term as an institution, kind of a cornerstone institution in a community that plans to be here for the next many decades, thinking about it in the long run as well? And the same thing for the social view from it in terms of a government mandate. We already have such a fractured society. Is there a legitimate view that a mandate further, certainly I think it's hard to argue that it definitely further fractures people into certain camps, right? They're going to dig in even more. Maybe there's some people who the mandate will tip in favor of getting vaccinated, but do we do more harm in the long run than near-term good by furthering those divides? That's something that I don't know the answer to, but it troubles me. I guess that's like the number one thing that troubles me about a mandate.
Yes, but at the same time, like a broader mandate, we are at record highs of occupancy right now. And what we are seeing right now is the vast majority of patients that we're seeing with COVID-19 in the hospital are unvaccinated, and we're burning out our healthcare providers. So the concern is about how do healthcare providers feel? I can tell you that, the vast majority we want you to get vaccinated, so we won't be this busy, so we're not burned out, so we're not going to staffing shortages. So hospitals don't have to put people in the halls. And I mean, this is an unsustainable situation when you have something that works. And it's hard for me to understand that. I am honestly troubled by this. I have vaccinated my whole family. I will never do anything against them. I think the best thing to say about this is it's just 96% of doctors agree on this vaccine. I don't know if you guys understand how much of a miracle it is to get 96% of doctors of this country to agree to anything. We are trained to argue.
Yeah.
We are trained to poke holes at scientific literature and say, this does not hold the rigor. And like, look at things that are in the gray zone and destroy it. That's what we do. And we love that. And 96% of us agree that this is good. I'm troubled to go in any other direction than like, we need to get this vaccine in this particular scenario. But you referenced that we've been doing this for flu. If you don't have your tetanus vaccine, it is hard for us to keep you there. There's some like exposures that you might have that will prevent. You want to have your MMR. You don't want measles. So I am. It's hard for me to understand.
You referenced history earlier.
I love history.
Well, as you know, there was tremendous resistance to the smallpox vaccination, right? Jenner, both in the UK and here. I think it was one of the things that precipitated the Massachusetts decision, actually. There's been...
And George Washington mandated vaccine, did smallpox in the troops.
Right.
So that's as early as a precedent, right?
So in one way, when you say you're sincerely troubled by the numbers of people not getting the vaccine, in a way, can this just be understood as a trend that's consistent throughout history, that it just takes X percentage of the population much longer to get on board with something like this? Because science, you're 96% withstanding. I'll play devil's advocate. There still have been times where the science has not been wrong, or it hasn't been right, sorry.
Yeah.
And the question about grave danger. The three of us might agree on that, but you can easily find articles that say, well, it's 1 in 500 people are actually dying, and they tend to be, have underlying symptoms or other kinds of comorbidities. And does it really pose a great danger to me or to my family?
Yeah,
So those are two questions.
I think first of all, I'm not insensitive to the fact that it's hard for people to get across all of these facts and just fathom I don't expect people to understand the scientific literature or to just trust us. So, I do understand that there's going to be a curve in there sometime. At the same time, we're not talking about something that we have a lot of time to deliberate. Like right now, the hospital is full. Our hospitals are full. We are struggling. So that is a context where, like, if we think about your question, which is what I'm trying to answer. So in the long term, we'll just there's the now, and there's time for a different discussion to the long term that I'm puzzled equally and don't have an answer. And yes, history has shown that people will take some time, but I appeal to all of us. Does anybody not believe that this work? I don't hear that, cell phones work, the microphone works, like people get in planes fly, and computers compute, and all of that is scientific method. It works. There's no question that it works. We all believe it. We are right now in a second floor of a building. That is maddening. We are in like tons of concrete, and something like some stakes are holding it out because someone did the right calculations. That is not, it's like short of a miracle. And yes, science has been wrong, like buildings collapse, computers explode, cell phones explode or fail, and planes crash. But overwhelmingly, things continue to get better, and there's better process around it, and we understand the world better, and science builds upon itself, and it's just better.
Can I? And I agree. Thank you. That was very well stated. To play devil's advocate myself,
Oh my God, I feel like in between two devils advocates.
I'll back off.
Now I understand why I'm in the middle.
Yeah, put you in the middle.
I'll take your side soon, don't worry.
Okay.
I'll go on the legal journey for a minute. So the Jacobson versus Massachusetts case, right? This smallpox, it was a pastor in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who had a bad reaction to I think they injected cowpox at the time as, anyway, to develop the immunity. And he had a bad reaction to that as a child, didn't want to get it. He actually did not raise religious liberty as sort of a basis for not being subject to the mandate. And that's a different story. But where I wanted to go with this is that at the time in 1904 or 5, as you said, George Washington required troops to get inoculated with the smallpox vaccine at the time. So this is something that had been around for 100+ years. And so when I read about arguments against the constitutionality of mandates for COVID vaccines, one point that people will make is that prior mandates have applied to things that we know well, like smallpox. We know the risks. We've had long-term studies of the impact of the vaccine, similar with the flu shot and some of the more modern vaccines. And the mRNA technology is different than what courts have I'm not sure that is as compelling to me a difference, but what do you make of that? I mean, I have a certain degree of empathy for that argument that yes, there's not as rich a history of study and experience here. On the other hand, nurses and doctors are obviously burned out and healthcare staffing is teetering on the brink. Is the necessary solution therefore a vaccine mandate? And how broad should it be? I guess, not to force you to answer those questions, but.
And I think they're great questions. And I don't know if the broader solution is a vaccine mandate for the reasons that you state, and I have empathy towards that. And I'm not coming here like we should mandate everyone. I don't have that answer. I do think that as a healthcare system, requiring the vaccine for the people that work there as a work hazard, the right thing to do for the community, I stand behind that and I'll defend that. Now, I will defend the science of this vaccine. This technology is now been available for 9 to 10 years. And it has been proven to be very safe. And I would love to, and that's a brilliant idea, to put it side by side with the cowpox injection, because that was like very early science, and you would just grab a pustule from a cow's udder and inoculate that with a needle in someone's arm. So if that has a better legal standing than this like high technology mRNA-based vaccine that has been studied in millions of people, that's the other part that people don't realize. I've heard this argument that like developing a vaccine takes like many years, and that is 100% true. Part of what it takes me like a lot of time is not the scientific development per se, it's just the bureaucracy of science. And what the pandemic has allowed us to do is to conduct those experiments in a massive scale in a very short period of time and prove that they're safe. And it does blow my mind, and I cannot take credit for this phrase, that people are willing to take anything but an FDA approved vaccine to treat themselves or prevent themselves from COVID. And it's just interesting. I understand how that happens. And I think it's our job. I mean, I wrote about this. It's our job to relate to people and meet them where they are and try to help them. Therefore, I'm here. I'm not trying to come as a snooty physician saying like our way or the highway. I agree with your point and your point. We need to talk more about it. We need to help people understand. We need to meet them on their terms. We need to explain. We need to spend more time, and we're willing to do it. But when you ask me as a physician and as a physician executive, like, is this the right thing to do? I will stand behind it.
Eric, I'm going to wrestle back the job of interlocutor from you
Okay.
and try to put you on the spot.
Sure.
Instead, you mentioned earlier that it's not clear from a federal point of view just how much power the government has to mandate. As you said, it'll be litigated, and we'll see. But there are a growing number of moral philosophers, and I think pretty prominent folks, Michael Sandel among them from Harvard and other places, who said, you know, one of the things that this shows us, these really widely disparate responses to the pandemic, is again, just how polarized we are, as we know, but also how little we're willing to sacrifice for one another. A lot of them hold up our history. And of course, World War II is the prime example of willingness to come together and just how far we moved from that. There are lots of speculation as to why that might be. But what this coalition of moral philosophers is calling for is it's time, again, in the interests of the common good, in the interests of, at least in the long term, unifying the country, to begin to use the power of the federal government to mandate things that are clearly in the public good. Now, it's called, I'll just do one short pedantic thing, sorry. In the literature, it's called weak paternalism, right? And I don't necessarily have a right to enforce something on Alejandro just for his own good, you know, stop drinking Coke, you know, or whatever. He can make that choice, it's his body, etc. But if his drinking Coke, or in this case, not being vaccinated, you know, does and can be shown empirically to redound negatively to the rest of us, either because we don't get herd immunity or because of the high levels of transmission, whatever it might be, why wouldn't I use every legal means at my disposal to mandate a vaccine when clearly not only his interests are at stake, but if he doesn't care about his own interests, he's got to at least care about mine.
Sure. That's a great question. And actually it's one that is really, you know, there's some parts of the Jacobson versus Massachusetts case from 1904 that really don't compare well to the current circumstances. But sort of the central theme of it was a 7-2 court decision with I think Justice Harlan writing, was basically that idea, right? That yes, the starting principle of our federal government is rooted in individual liberty and autonomy, but that's not a boundless liberty. That's not a boundless right, because none of us can truly experience boundless liberty, endless freedom, if that means in doing so, we can inflict harm on others, we can spread a virus, we can pollute. You know, there are some examples even that I think libertarians, the certain persuasion would agree, yeah, that's an appropriate limitation on individual autonomy because it restricts to a too great a degree the liberty and autonomy of my fellow citizen or my neighbor or whoever it may be. And I think where we've struggled inside and outside the courts, and definitely in school board meetings from my witnessing, is where do we draw that line and how do we have a good conversation about it? Who should be leading that dialogue? I think we really need to improve the process around those discussions, and it requires a degree of civic engagement that the pandemic, you know, unfortunately has limited because of the inability to convene in person as much. But even before that, right, we're becoming more and more islands to ourselves, right? Like viewing the world through this personal liberty perspective without, you know, kind of that obligation to the other citizens. And so I wish I had the panacea to that problem. I don't. But
Sorry.
No, I think it's critical that we, you know, we press each other when we're having these discussions respectfully, like we all are, share good information with one another so that, you know, hopefully we can make good decisions short of government requirements, right? Maybe collectively we can act at the local or state level in a way that doesn't require a law because an industry came together with a best practice or a school district came up with a good practice. But short of that, yeah, I do think that there probably is a role for the federal government to exercise what authority it does have to at least nudge people to make better decisions collectively.
And we can ask, like, I mean, for instance, because we're talking about this, like, there's no cost associated with this. Like, we're gonna pay a price. We are paying a price, and it might get like larger. What is your thought about that? I mean, like, there's insurance companies now that are announcing that they're gonna have a premium if you're not vaccinated, because it's likely that you will cost thousands of dollars to society somehow.
Right. And the same for each company under the new rule that will be coming out is, one clever way that somebody talked about this new rule is not a vaccine mandate with a testing opt-out, but instead a testing requirement with a vaccine opt-out. And so if you took it on the idea that the default is everybody needs to get tested unless you get vaccinated, maybe that looks a little bit better, but it costs a lot more. And so who's gonna pay, does it cost fall on the employee who's already at a living wage? Does the cost fall on the employer who, may already be struggling financially, depending on what happens with the economy here? Does it fall on the federal government? And so, yeah, there definitely will be costs to bear for people who do not get vaccinated. I would estimate, I would imagine. I haven't reviewed, kind of the economic literature on it, but I'd have to assume that the cost of an unvaccinated person in the long run is more than a vaccinated person, and that does ultimately fall to somebody else unless we impose it on that individual, which is a tough thing for an employer, at least to do. Some have done it though.
But let me follow that line, and it was sort of putting a twist on this question of government mandates. All right, hands off. Government said, do what you want. It's laissez-faire. Every man, woman, and child to him or herself. Even though we don't do that for good reason. But maybe specifically for you, Alejandro, and this is going to seem like sacrilege and far-fetched, except that I've heard so many people whisper it at this point. I'm wondering
I'm curious
if you want to even comment on it. And that is precisely because of burnout, because there is choice involved, because those who would not get vaccinated, in fact, said, this is my right to do as I please. Fine, it's your right. You bear the consequences of that. We're not going to treat. There was an article about a physician in private practice who sent out a notification. Apparently this is illegal. I didn't realize that. Said that, if you're not vaccinated, you're not welcome in the office. We're just not going to handle it. It's a big controversy, and he lost 30% of his business where it was down in Houston. You talked earlier about the urgency of this, and how dramatic it is, and the incredible toll taken on medical frontline personnel. So I know it's a hard thing to even suggest, but at some point, do you say, look, you made this choice. Here are the consequences.
It's a horrible question.
Yeah, thank you. If I hadn't read about it, I would have asked.
I know, but it needs dialogue, and it's a sad reality. It is sad that we're here, that we have a problem with a solution, and we are, as a society, we need to make some choices that are tough, and we might be put in a position. We might be put people who care for delivering good care and are proud of delivering good care in a position to, and it is happening in the country already, right? I mean, it's a little bit like Katrina, and there's books written about this, which is horrible. People making on a whim decisions or life or death because of resources and environmental circumstances. I don't wish that on the worst person on this planet. It is a horrible thing to bear. And people are getting to that point that you have to make trade-offs. I don't think anybody in healthcare will be as callous as says like, well, you can get it, but what could potentially happen, and it has happened in all areas, not here, is that you are choosing between, young person cancer undergoing cancer treatment unvaccinated and the last ventilator, and person who decide willingly not to get vaccinated and needs a ventilator with some comorbidity or somehow, and this person could not mount immunity, and he was vaccinated, but he got into a pretty bad spot, and he has a life ahead, and maybe longer life than this person, who knows? It's a horrible ethical question. It's difficult. It needs to be asked. It needs to have the dialogue, because hopefully talking about these things will get us to, let's try not to get there.
Yeah. And I'm sorry to just be interested to complicate it further. I agree. It's a horrible thing to think about. And I would not want to be in that position of a healthcare provider having to make those judgments. But I wonder, and I'm curious, Michael, about your perspective on this from an ethical.
Let's ask Michael some questions.
Yeah, more kind of moral philosophy. Turn it around a little bit.
I brought notes, so I should be all right.
Does it make a difference why somebody decided not to vaccinate in those circumstances, right? Like if we have 10 people all with similar symptoms coming into the ER, and using rough statistics, so say like 6 of them are vaccinated for whatever reason. And let's just assume we don't even need to rank them by why they got vaccinated, but then we've got 4 people. One person decided not to do it because they're an African American and they have a legacy concern about experimental vaccinations and treatments from history in the United States. One person has a sincerely held religious belief, for whatever it might be. I'm not exactly sure, what that would look like, but let's assume
Well,
it's
just to fill that in, the Catholic point of view, of course, is that if it's derived from cells from an aborted fetus, that complicates.
Okay.
The papal certificate on this was if there are absolutely no other alternatives available, that you would still be absolved from evil in that case.
Well, okay, so that person is in the queue, and it's too late to get vaccinated given where they're at with their symptoms. We've got somebody who just said, I'm going to wait and see because I want to be cautious and kind of see how the science plays out. And then we've got somebody who just doesn't believe in the science at all, doesn't care. It's all about political statement about personal autonomy. I guess to make the question harder, or maybe to.
It doesn't need to be harder. I think you're fine there.
We can deal with the 6 people who are vaccinated because their symptoms, even if they're infected, their symptoms are.
And then there's a hurricane.
More manageable, right? Their symptoms are more manageable because they were vaccinated, and good for you. But there's only, we can only take 2 or 3 of the others. I would hate to, because if you start to think about not treating people, then don't you have to dig a layer deeper to understand why they're not vaccinated, and is that too intrusive?
So the ethics of intent do matter to an awful lot of people who make these kinds of decisions. It matters in our legal system, right? I mean, how many kinds of homicide are there, right? What was your intent when you were doing this? And I think you raised rightly the question of equity too. I probably until 2 weeks ago, until I read an article on this, I think I was flying blind in terms of thinking, well, everybody in the country who's really wanted to get the vaccine should certainly have had access to it at this point. And the New York Times, which I still give some credibility, did a pretty in-depth study. And so that's just not the case, whether it's people working 2 jobs or they're rural or whatever the reason might be. There were a handful of them, through no fault of their own at this point, or at least through difficulty in obtaining it. The vaccine has not been obtained, right, which complicates it too. So is there some sort of taxonomy of degrees of, there is in the medical ethics literature a kind of standard protocol for triage, right? And Alejandro alluded to one of them earlier, and people might not like it, but those decisions are so hard. They're, in some ways, I think they're outside of the realm of ethics. They fall into Greek tragedy. Oftentimes more than they do sort of rational deliberation that's going to resolve things to everybody's satisfaction. But if you do have a young person who, the quality of life seems possible, you're going to put, $8 million into them as opposed to $8 million into somebody who's dying at 85. I mean, I think it strikes most of us as intuitive to suggest that everything else being equal, you would lend the resources that are otherwise scarce to a person whose quality of life is likely to be better. I understand the reason I asked the question, so I'm struggling with it too. I understand the baseline for physicians is if somebody comes into the ER, you don't ask the question, well, were they involved in a criminal activity while they were doing this? Or right, all that stuff is supposed to be off the table. You treat first, you let other institutions in society figure that out. I guess the reason I wanted to bring it up with Alejandro especially is just hearing that there's a kind of utilitarian and, if you don't mind my saying so, kind of psychological aspect of this in terms of the sheer number of people that I work with too in medicine who are saying, I can't do this anymore. And my resentment, if I do have to keep treating people who have willfully put themselves in a situation, let's take your last person, number 10. I'm starting to question my own commitments to the profession and what it is I'm being asked to do. And in that case, after all the dialogue, after all the education, after every empathetic and sympathetic possibility you can muster, what I would like to see happen, if we get down to that point where, again, it's say we get another mutation, there's a huge surge, the health crisis just is going to continue, it's decimating the economy, it's not 1 in 500 now, it's 1 in 200, whatever it might be. The government only has legitimacy insofar as it safeguards the health and well-being of the people, right? And at that point, the health, and I would say now, but the health and well-being of most of us is compromised by this particular pandemic. And the responsibility ought not fall on Alejandro's shoulders, it ought to fall on
my shoulders.
On your shoulders.
Thank you for that.
Right. With his consultation, with all the input, all the expertise he can give you to say, in the same way, look, you can't go to school if you don't have these immunizations. You can't go to school if you're not going to wear a mask. You can't go to school if you don't have a COVID vaccine. You can't come to Grand Valley. We said that. I mean, there are a number of institutions we've already said that before. It looks like that's only going to expand. What holds us back from forcing the issue? So at least we approach something like herd immunity. I mean, that's the weak paternalism. It's like, I realize you're not going to do it for yourself. I respect you have these deeply held views about autonomy, liberty, justice. Those are in direct conflict with, non-maleficence, benevolence, etc. In this case, the public, crass utilitarianism, the public good outweighs your individual liberty rights, right? We've said that so many times in our history. I can be drafted, right? I certainly have to pay my taxes. There are all kinds of obligations that are imposed on me as a citizen who otherwise enjoys the benefits of living here. I think that, we skirted around it. I don't know that we want to go there. This question of why does 40% of the population feel so disaffected and so willing to try kind of in some ways crazy experimental drugs as opposed to an FDA approved? How did that skepticism about our institutions get so widespread that they look at you, and you anticipated it, and said, oh, and it's some snooty doctor who's probably not even from the United States, comes in here, reaps all the benefits of, doing this. Look at me, I'm still struggling. Why should I listen to him? You know all that. So that the three of us aren't going to solve that dilemma. But he might well have to, you might have to adjudicate this with, in courts, with somebody who's going to sue their employer.
Sure.
And I was going to have to deal with it, A, with frontline staff leaving, and B, with patients who are going to continue to put his institution at risk. Is that fair? That doesn't answer your question because it's so hard to answer. I just think that we shouldn't have to answer it. That's why we have institutions
right
in place.
Well, I will say from a legal point of view, so given our system of federalism, where unless something is specifically powers granted to the federal government under the Constitution, it kind of defaults to the states to So the federal government is seen as a gap filler historically in our system. And that's a big part of the problem as it relates to coordinating a collective response to many things where there's not a clear or a arguably applicable statutory hook at the federal level. But it still doesn't solve the question of, okay, well then why don't state and local governments act when they clearly do have the police power and sort of the plenary power to watch out for public health and public good. And you know, I don't think a lot of people have covered themselves in glory when it comes to needing necessary political cover to do things that they know, based on the types of arguments you and Alejandro have made, are the right decision from a public health and kind of whatever you want to look at, utilitarian or just weak paternalism sort of point of view. That's the right decision, but somebody has to make it, and nobody wants to be the one to make it. And I understand it to a degree because right here in Kent County, right, our health directors receive death threats many times and has sincerely felt at risk. I don't know what we do about people like that other than pursue appropriate penalties for people who threaten public officials. But I think people need to be engaged at the state and local level because that's the clearest cut place where there is a power and authority to make these decisions. In some places, you know, I guess I won't editorialize on whether I think it's good or bad that power has been exercised by state legislatures to restrict the ability of private employers and universities and health systems to impose mandates. So clearly there is an ability to cause action at the state level and the local level, but I think people need to focus their efforts on having political accountability for those who are conspicuously silent when it comes to saying what they believe is in the best interest, even if they may not have the instant power to impact that change, because it sets a tone and example for other institutions to follow, whether it's a hospital system or a private employer. Like after the federal government announced that it was going to begin a test or vaccine program in July, you saw a lot of large employers kind of follow suit and put in place similar programs. So we need more of that kind of, and I'm not that specific example of federal government acting, but we need more public leaders willing to take that kind of political hit, you know, that they know they're going to take from the 40% of people to set an example so others can say, well, they're doing it. And so that's a model I want to follow. Because like I said before, a lot of the questions we get asked from clients are, what are other people doing? Because they don't want to be the outlier. They want to be nicely in the norm, you know, like in the mean, right? Sure. So that doesn't answer the question, but I think, you know, rewarding those who show leadership and let you know where they stand. Even if you disagree, you don't have to reward them if you disagree with them, but at least acknowledge that they're being open about their position and give them credit for that. So you know who and what you're dealing with.
Good. Something you said earlier makes springing this on you. So if you want to decline.
I'm going to preface this by like a lawyer, a doctor, and an ethicist what walk into the room. Insert joke here. And then like, I'm going to instill here that like, of course, the doctors are going to like aim towards like pragmatism because we are dealing with the problems in our hand. And, you know, not to say that, you know, I hear your answers and they're right on, but they're a little bit more detached than the reality that I'm living. So it's, you guys are right. It is difficult and it needs debate, yet there's no time for that much debate and pragmatism needs to come into place.
Treatment would not go well if Michael and I were at the triage table.
Definitely not.
Like, okay.
Well, have you thought about?
Yeah.
There's could be another
Sorry,
consideration.
not to be glib, not to be glib
Before you
about a serious
cut,
problem,
like,
but
have we really analyzed?
Well, I'm afraid to say it sometimes out loud, but maybe that's the problem. But Erik, the way you laid it out, you know, in terms of your 10, right? The 6 vaccinated, the 4 unvaccinated. Now, I don't want to, it's probably a good thing I'm not there, but I have the least sympathy and empathy for the person who comes in 10th there. And if there's a triage, it's a matter of triage, right? And this person fully understood the consequences of this, right? I think what you're saying is, I think there's always a question as to whether somebody fully understands the consequences of the decisions they're making, just how free they are, how cognitive. Sure. So in a way, what I'm thinking is to want to play this with you for exactly the reasons you're both bringing up, because the pragmatic side appeals to me as well. So you said dialogue is important. We don't do a good job educating people. People don't understand, et cetera. So if I walk in and I'm just even this much open-minded, I say, I've heard these terrible things about the vaccine. Nobody I know in my community has gotten it. We don't even wear masks. And yet there was, there was somebody in the other town over who was not vaccinated and got it and died. I don't want to die. I don't know what to do.
I mean, we're game. I mean, there's a lot of conversation that we can have about that. And yes, I mean, we will talk about the potential of the vaccine to prevent this. I mean, it will work. And I don't know if you want to role play it.
But why? Of course I do. You know.
Yeah, I know Michael very well.
I think people in this room understand that. So you would ask me about well, I don't really understand the science, but I've read an awful lot of things that suggest that people have gotten really sick from this, and it hasn't been well vetted. I mean, I don't want you to go over all that because we were talking about it. But if I'm in that distress about it, I mean, if I come in and having that conversation, what do you think it is I'm really looking for from you?
I mean, you're looking for a connection. You're looking for me to see you as a human being, for me not to just speak in scientific terms, for me not to dismiss you, for me to validate your concerns. And they're real. We're scared. You're scared. I'm here. My job is to, I was talking to someone who's a primary care doctor today, and he's saying, our job has become more to be a therapist because we're dealing with the poor choices that people make on a daily basis. And that's part of our role. This is, if you want to be a primary care doctor, that is the job. And that really has been applied in the pandemic. So yes, we have to apply those principles of therapy, you feeling heard, you feeling acknowledged. Let me understand your perspective. Let me walk for a second in your shoes. And then let me bring you here inch by inch to show you in your terms why I believe or how this can help you and benefit you.
So I just don't want anybody putting something in my body that I don't understand.
I totally understand that, and we can we're the vaccine that you're talking about is a process that happens millions of times every second in your body already. It's something that is speaking the language and the terms of your body, and we're using your own biology to create defense against this virus. So that is the foreign thing that you don't want in your body.
It doesn't alter my DNA.
It does not alter your DNA. And there's science of trying to alter DNA that's very dangerous and has not gone well. This is not DNA altering. This is RNA, which is that step between DNA and proteins, and it's just doesn't stay there forever. Just helps create a replica of the virus that does not affect you and teaches your body how to fight this.
Then why are so many people concerned about long-term effects? Science doesn't know what the long-term effects of this will be.
And it's a very valid point. But we know that right now people are dying because of this. The long-term effects, right now, they seem that they're very unlikely to have negative long-term effects. Most of the vaccines that will have side effects, you'll see it in the first few months. And there's millions of people who've gotten these vaccines, and we know what the side effects are. And in comparison to what could happen, the risk is minimal.
It's not hard to convince me, actually. So, I don't know how much farther I can go with that.
But I would for instance, I love these graphics where the Joint Commission has come up with this graphics of showing the pandemic in numbers, filling Shea Stadium, and just showing vaccinated versus unvaccinated. and it makes a very visually appealing argument. And the first argument that they make is just showing the numbers of people in graph, just that will fill in the stadium before the vaccine, that were getting infected with COVID, and how many stadiums will it take. And then they show the effect of the vaccine, and then how many are vaccinated versus unvaccinated. And obviously, it takes like just a small bleacher of the people who are dying that are vaccinated versus, you know, many stadiums of people full that are dying that are unvaccinated. And also they show a graph that if the vaccine didn't work, this is how this graph should look. And it should be 50-50. They should be should be dying and equal, and they're not. So this is not and by the way, anybody who comes with the argument of, I don't want to put anything in my body and drinks Mountain Dew, you know, like any horrible substance in my body and drink Mountain Dew or do all the sorts of horrible things that we all do to our body, you know, I will also want to have that argument. So there's many visuals and many relatable things to our daily life that we can utilize. And yes, it's scary. And I'll argue again, it's scary the same way that it's scary to get into a plane, but you're trusting it because we're telling you that the science works. Now it's easier to see the plane fly. Still a miracle.
All right, I'll ask one more question. I'm Michael's spouse in the room asking. I'm also skeptical about this, and I'm
gonna role play too.
I'm continuing the role playing.
Okay,
yes.
you're friends of Michael. I can
Yes.
tell.
I should have gotten you at least a couple bottles of wine.
Definitely.
Yeah. So how is this going to be enforced? Like, is there going to be a database of, you know, it would mention stadiums, or in the Shea Stadium made me think of baseball, and I've heard that they're going to require a passport, or I'm going to have to be tracked in a central database, and that's not something that appeals to my sense of liberty and privacy.
Do you have Facebook?
Well, I have Facebook, yes.
Okay, and then like the argument is no.
I curate my Facebook very carefully.
In your pocket.
Right.
You don't know Mark Zuckerberg.
Right. But I'm concerned about this being the first step on the path of a centralized database of my health choices. And again, playing devil's advocate here, another question I have, is this something where I'm going to have to continue to come in? And like, if I do this now, do I have to get a booster? We don't seem to know that yet. And so like, what am I signing up for here? Is this like a long-term thing where the record's going to be out there forever, or, you know,
I mean, I don't know. I don't have those answers. I definitely don't. I hope that the record is kept forever in a safe place, because that's how science works, right? The better we keep records, the better we can like tap back into them and make better arguments for the future. None of you guys have made the argument that like someone's trying to microchip you, which is like a very famous one. And that is just fascinating, because like to go through the length of insert that little microchip when everybody's carrying a cell phone, and like I am sure like to some degree it's easier to access that. It's an interesting argument.
I didn't want to give that credence, but
Yeah, well,
Alejandro, I've got a question. It's not a role playing question, so we can stop that. But if you're in that kind of a conversation, it must be tempting to say something like, well, you don't want that in your body, but you're increasing the chances by not being vaccinated that you're spreading something that will end up in someone else's body. And can you see that perspective? I don't know what the clinical approach is there when you're dealing with somebody who's skeptical like that. Like, if you begin to challenge them in that way, is it helpful, or like?
to some people it is. I mean, it's a very good argument, because it worked for some people, because a lot of people, to Michael's argument earlier, it's like, I'm young, I'm fit, like, and I've seen the data, the risk to me is minimal. It's like, okay, who do you live with? It's like, do you see grandma? Do you see grandpa? Do you see your aunt? We know by your history that your brother had cancer. Your kids have asthma. there's a lot of things that like that conversation does work, and a lot of people end up getting the vaccine because it will help their loved ones, and it's a very appealing argument. Unfortunately, just things have gotten so polarized
Right.
that like the arguments are, we're running out of them.
Yeah.
And I wrote a blog about it that like, we don't get to give up as healthcare workers. We just don't. But that's why we trust the ethicists and the lawyers to help us with the argument. We're tired, we're burnt out, and yet we need to continue having the discussion.
So Erik, I want to bring this back around. Summing up relatively soon, but I also want to ask if there's anybody here in the room who has a question before we end up. But can you, as clearly and succinctly as you can, for people who are watching this and have questions about it, can you try to distill that argument from a legal perspective about where my autonomy, where my rights run into other people's rights as well, and what you think is especially maybe good law that helps illustrate that as a maybe guiding principle for this conversation?
Sure. So I'll qualify this, and I probably should have said this at the outset, is that I'm not providing legal advice, and these are my views, not the views of Miller Johnson over across the river or our clients. But if I were to kind of succinctly state this, although I would say that the Jacobson versus Massachusetts case isn't exactly applicable in the same way it was in that scenario to our current circumstance, I think the central concept is very applicable. It was probably going above and beyond what they needed to say in that particular opinion, but the idea that in order for us to achieve what we believe our Constitution promises each of us, right, which is life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, although that's not really, that's in the preamble, it's not enforcement, but that's what people think about, right, and that's important. In order for us to be able to do that, we need to accept that there are going to be limitations on our own individual freedoms and liberties so that others among us can enjoy them. Otherwise, you know, it's chaotic. Anytime we impose those limitations, however, it should be based upon a thoughtful approach. If I'm arguing a more, maybe say, conservative view of this argument based on a specific kind of legislative textual determination and not tied to something broad and sweeping that may have been enacted as a law in a very different circumstance, but arguably applies. I would say the more that we can recognize that there must be limits on each person and have a rational and specific basis for drawing that line with arguments backing it up, whether it's based on science or ethics or legal precedent. I think big picture, that's kind of where we are. And I would add to that, I think I would caution against what we can expect in terms of broad federal government enforcement of a mandate. Even if the mandate, as articulated, is in place for some time, the resources to enforce it are scant. And you can't commandeer local officials so the federal government can't say, Michigan police go and inspect the workplace, right? They've got to use OSHA inspectors and federal resources. So even if the law is in place for some period of time before it has its final day in the Supreme Court, you know, the likelihood of it being enforced strictly is very low. And so we need to look to state and local law wherever we are and hold those local and state officials accountable and get them to state clearly what their views are.
Good. Thank you. I know you feel a little maybe picked on by both of us for both sides here. You've more than held your own, as you always do. Anything that you haven't gotten to or want to be asked that hasn't come up?
I mean, I think to me, it's really important that, I mean, there's a lot of people advocating for themselves and for mothers, and there's some things that are hard to understand when we have a preventative measure that works as well. There's a recent article just showing that, speaking of long-term effects, that this pandemic has already created in the United States, I think it was 150,000 to 170,000 orphans, meaning someone who has lost either both of their parents or who was under a single parent and that parent died, or a caregiver that died. And I see this argument not being analyzed enough. And I understand your individual rights. I want to, like it's not my place to do anything with your individual rights. From the employment perspective, if you want to work here, I mean, there are some rules that we can impose and you can work elsewhere. I understand that. It's not, we have exceptions, there's some rules there, but people are dying and there's a prevention measure. And then people who cannot advocate for themselves and might not have enough people in their corner advocating for themselves are going to have long-lasting consequences of this. And that is a tragedy. When we're seeing from some pragmatic eyes, and I understand that we cannot go into a total utilitarian state, but there is an utilitarian argument to be made, but it's hard. I understand that, but at least that, like, if we're thinking about long-term consequences, let's be consequent with what we're saying, and think about people who are very negatively impacted from this. I cannot imagine a worse consequences than either dying or losing your parents at a young age.
Awesome. Thank you both. Before we wrap this up, though, if there is one question, we'd be happy to take it. Anna.
So it's a question for you, Dr. Quiroga. So you've been talking about long-term effects of being vaccinated, unvaccinated, and type 1 diabetes. So I was like first in line, I was waiting for that approval to come in to get vaccinated, and it happened. But when it got approved for, for minors, I have a son, he's 15, and he just said, I asked him, what do you think? And he said, oh, I'll do whatever you say, I trust you. I said, well, thank you, but I don't know anything, besides, what Dr. Fauci and the pediatrician said, and they said, yeah, go for it. So he is vaccinated right now, but you can't help wondering about the long-term effects, because you don't have any evidence that that anything is gonna happen to him, but then there's no long-term research because it was created last year, right? So what about those parents that are hesitating because there's actually no evidence of the longer term effects? You see what I'm saying?
100%. And so I'm a pediatrician by training. I'm a pediatric nephrologist, and so I'm a kidney specialist in kids, so not practicing general pediatrics, but I'm training pediatrics, and I'm a father of 3. And the odds that there's going to be a long-term effect that is unforeseeable right now, it seems very low with 9 years of knowing how this works. And nothing is 100%, nothing is perfect. And we're always playing with life, the game of odds. Catastrophic things can happen right now, and the odds are, that we're gonna be struck by a meteor, it's low, and we don't spend a second thinking of that. And I'm not trying to trivialize your question because it's right on. It's just a very good question, but the odds are very low, if minimal, that something long-term is gonna happen. And the studies on pediatrics took longer for that reason. We're talking with people that are about people who are not making their own decisions, and we're making them for them. And pediatric patients are not the same as adults. So we needed to have like like robust enough studies. And that's why right now it's only approved for 12 years and up. But soon will be approved for 5 years and up. Because those studies are showing just equal safety profile of the vaccine. Out of my 3 kids, 2 are older than 12 and fully vaccinated, but they're grown-ups. And I have a 5-year-old that I cannot wait for the vaccine to be available, to give it to her. And she is the love of my life and the light of my existence and the human being that I feel the most responsible for on this earth. And because of that, I want to vaccinate her.
We are coming close to time, but there's a question here that probably only takes about another day and a half to answer. So I'm going to read it, and then we'll ask everybody to close on this one. We, the panelists, seems like we're relying heavily on the argument that the public good outweighs individual rights in the case of a pandemic, or at least a grave one like this one. But maybe that's an erroneous argument for many Americans who really don't care about the broader society. What does that say about the viability of our democracy? And is there an historic precedent for this attitude, starting to care about one another, winning the day? Okay, you know what I want to do with that question? I want to recommend about 16 books. But my guess is this person has already read them. So I don't know if you want to go there or not.
Well, I think what I would say is, and you mentioned the draft earlier, right? That it's not current, but we've had situations in the country's history where, but for very narrow exemptions, you could be drafted into military service actively. And yeah, it's disheartening to think about. Even after, Vietnam, there was such social discord, although it does seem like when we find a common, I don't want to say enemy, but a common subject of our collective action, right? And view ourselves as acting in concert for a common purpose. It seems so rare that we find those situations now. But I think they do still happen sometimes where we have that sense, like after September 11th, I remember kind of the country, however briefly, feeling sort of united, maybe not for all for the same reasons, but I think there are times when things get so bleak, or even things feel so bleak that it does bring us together. And it's probably not the best answer or the best system of government that requires that kind of a dark place to bring people back together. But maybe it's better than, it's the best we've got right now, right? Maybe it's not the best, but
it's the old Churchill line, right?
Yeah.
It's a terrible, awful form of government. It's right.
Exactly.
Except for all the others.
Except for all the others. But it seems like that's the kind of thing that is required before a sufficient, we get herd immunity from our own divisiveness, let's say, is when some event happens that brings 86% of us, or whatever the percentage for herd immunity is. We need something to catalyze herd immunity against our own divisiveness toward one another. So it is a dark view of things, but I do think it's still worth kind of fighting in the moment when things seem divisive, because you still have your own individual obligations as a citizen to be accountable for yourself and your family and your neighbors. So I don't think the fact that some people may view the world so individualistically kind of absolves those who don't, of having to act, the way that their moral compass points them.
I mean, I'm talking here like least qualified person to ask that question, but I pose a question back. Isn't like democracy always under scrutiny and at risk, and nothing but the decisions that we make for the greater good on a daily basis is what would uphold it. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, I think so. And let me put in a good word for young people, which doesn't often happen these days. I spend a lot of my life in front of young people, and to my great relief, many of them, while climate change and inequities and that sort of thing are certainly, at or near the top of the list of things that concern them, it is the polarization, is the fact that we can't talk to one another. It's their sense of anxiety and even fear that, we will turn against one another. That is something they're A, acutely aware of, and B, want to address. So if my experience, it's a relatively small sample size, but nonetheless, if my experience says anything, it's they're aware of it. They feel not entirely powerless, which is good, to begin to address it, and they want to address it. So there is a vision that many of them have that things can and should be different, that could set us on, I think, a better course than the one perhaps that we're leaving. I want to thank Erik Daly from Miller Johnson.
Thank you.
So much for your expertise, thoughtful comments, insights. Really appreciate it.
Thank
And
you.
Dr. Quiroga, who went above and beyond by agreeing to role play. He had no idea that was coming, except he knows me well enough to, he should have anticipated it, so I don't feel that bad about it. But again, for your insights and eloquence and compassion around this particular issue. So thank you so much for both taking the time. And thank you all for joining us. And November 4th, let me put in a plug. Speaking of climate change, the Koeze Business Ethics Initiative is going to bring in 2 speakers on the future of Michigan as a climate refugee state. 2 experts on that particular subject. There will be more information about that on the Seaman College of Business website. November 4th, that's a Thursday at 2:30 here on campus. Thank you all for joining us. See you again. Thanks.